Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Sarko. I'm a data dissemination specialist from the Census Bureau. And today I'm going to talk about a brief history of the census from our earliest census, 1790, to our most current census, 2020. The outline for today, I'm going to talk about, I've got it broken down into basically four periods. The early census history, which is 1790 to 1840. And then redefining the census, the 1850 census, all the way to the 1900 census. And then sort of the census transition period from 1902 to 1930. And then modernization of the census, which occurred from 1940 to 2020. And then any questions you may have. First, I'd like a couple of disclaimers. Historic census records are maintained and released only by the National Archives and Records Administration. The Census Bureau does not and never will release individual census records. And many of you know, or probably all of you know, the National Archives releases census records only after 72 years. And whenever we're talking about historical material, there are going to be things that are inappropriate or offensive by today's standards. So I want to remind people that all historical content, history census documents may contain outdated terminology or views which, reflecting the author's attitudes or that of the period in which the item was written, may be considered to be inappropriate or offensive today. Why take a census? Because of course it's mandated by the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. It's used for the apportionment of representatives. It's not used for conscription or punitive taxation. And the Supreme Court has ruled that this covers other statistical collection as needed for intelligent exercise of powers enumerated in the Constitution. The first census was in 1790. In 1790, Congress passed the first Census Act, which required that the enumeration begin on Monday, August 2nd, 1790, and be conducted by marshals of the U.S. judicial districts. Under the direction of Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State at the time, marshals took the census in the original 13 states, plus the districts of Kentucky, Maine, Vermont, and the Southwest Territory, which is Tennessee. There were no schedules for Delaware, Georgia, Kentucky, New Jersey, Tennessee, and Virginia, which they were likely destroyed in their British attack on Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812. And there were no blank printed census forms. Each marshal had to use whatever paper they had available. So the census returns during this time, and even on the other earlier censuses, they varied in page length from 4 inches to 3 feet long. And the reason they used the marshals to conduct the enumeration is that they were basically the only federal officers that were all over the country. And it took about 3 years to get all the numbers from the 1790 census brought back in. The U.S. Marshals would hire deputy marshals, and they literally had to go and figure out where all the houses were. We counted not only the 13 original states, but we also counted the territories. Tennessee hoped to be able to have enough people to become a state, and they fell a little short, but we still counted their numbers in our total numbers. So you see, in 1790, we counted free white males 16 and older, and that was chosen because they wanted to know how many men of military age were in the United States at the time. Everyone who was not white or black was classified as white, and Indians living on reservations were not counted. And indentured servants were counted as under free persons. And unfortunately, many of the early censuses were burned by the British during the War of 1812. 1790, 1800, and a good portion of 1810, particularly from the states like Virginia and Maryland, were lost and had to be recreated from other data. And as a matter of fact, George Washington is the only president that we don't have an original census form for. because he died in 1799 before the 1800 census, and his 1790 census was burnt during the war. In 1800, the questionnaire we provided was made to tally free white males and females in several age categories. Under 10, 10 to 15, 16 but under 25, 25 but under 45, and over 45. Indians, slaves, and free blacks were listed in single categories and not divided into any age groups, just simply by sex. In 1810, we really saw for the beginning of the increase of what we could use the census to collect data on for when we added the census of manufacturers. However, people weren't completely trusting of the government. We always like to say that the United States was founded on the basis of mistrust of government and government power. So people were reluctant to tell the census, especially home businesses, which were those were the vast majority of businesses. They were farm businesses, home businesses. They were reluctant to tell the government agent exactly how much their goods and services were worth and how much money they made. So the collection of manufacturing data was so erratic in 1810 that it was generally considered useless, except to identify some broad industrial trends. In 1820, we added a couple of questions, including the number of household members working in agriculture, commerce, and manufacturing. And all races were tallied by age group this time for the first time. And this was the first time we asked how many non-naturalized citizens were in each household. We needed to know, how many people were citizens, particularly if it pertained to voting. In 1830, we started collecting social statistics and vital statistics, including the number of deaf and blind people. This was the first time that we used the census for social statistics and to determine where money for certain groups should go. They wanted to start putting schools for the blind around the country, and they had to see where it would make the most sense to put these schools. This was the first census to use a uniform printed schedule. No manufacturing data was collected in 1830 since it was done so poorly in years past. In 1840, we started to collect a number of Revolutionary War pensioners. We needed to know where the Revolutionary War pensioners were because we wanted to estimate the cost of paying the pensions for the pensioners their pensions. In 1840, we started collecting manufacturing industry point of data again because we needed to know where our industry was going. This was the start of the Industrial Revolution. We also did a separate agricultural schedule and a schedule on schooling and literacy because this was the beginning when they would start being put together public schools. They wanted to know where people were and what was the level of their understanding of the people. 1850 marked a revolution in statistical analysis. So we slowly started in 1850 seeing the Census Bureau become more than just the tallying up numbers. We could take these numbers and we could analyze them. We could read things from them. So in 1850, not only did the individual become the unit of data collection, but we greatly expanded the questions that we asked in previous censuses. In previous censuses, we just collected the head of household. We added new questions about occupations, literacy, taxes, crime, wages, birthplace, property ownership, and married in the past year. 1860 is when we started including American Indians to the list of races. At this point, Indians not taxed weren't included in that because those were the Indians living on the reservations. They were considered to be their own nation. So they were not considered as an apportionment because of that they had their own laws and they had their own government. Enumerators were instructed to put IND opposite the name of the free Indians. 1870 marked the beginning of modern statistical analysis. It was the first census where every single person in every single household was named. 1870 was also the first census where there was no slave schedule. So in 1850 and 1860, you would have the names of everybody in the free household. But the slave schedule would only have sex and age. 1870 was the first census where every single person in every single household was named. Before 1870, a lot of times within the household, they wouldn't even write the whole name. They would just put initials. But in 1870 is when every single person in the United States had their name listed on the census. 1870 was actually the first census to list all African Americans. The seat tabulating machine was used. The job of tabulating questionnaires, the responses, was beginning to get overly burdensome for the census office. And this problem was partially alleviated with the use of the rudimentary seat tabulating machine, which was invented by a chief clerk of the census office. There was also a question about males 21 and over to see if their vote was denied. Because the decennial census was used to determine the population of a state for the purposes of the representation, it was necessary to add a question about whether an individual had been denied voting rights. This question was designed to determine the extent to which former slaves were legally denied their right to vote. In 1880, we started using professional enumerators. In 1880, we also did the census of Indians not taxed. For the first time, we went on reservations. And they not only counted the people, but they looked at their system of government, their system of family. How did they dress? What did they do for leisure? What was their education levels, and so forth. And for some of the smaller tribes, this was the only way that we preserved to know how some of those tribes lived back then. And by 1880, we already had just taken possession of Alaska. So this was the first census of Alaska. Although there's kind of a little bit of a controversy, there's a belief that maybe some of those numbers were made up rather than fight through some of the hardships of Alaska that made up some of the tribes. And so they made up some of the tribes in numbers there. In 1890, we used the Hollerith machine, which became the first electronic tabulating machine and the forerunner of a modern computer. And so they hired large numbers of people who would put the information on the punch cards, which were then fed in the machines. And one schedule might have 10 different punch cards because they would do one punch card for race, they would do one punch card for age, and so forth. In 1890, they also added the racial categories, different racial categories, and specifically of Japanese. This is the first time we had Japanese immigrants coming over in large numbers. And all of these racial categories were precisely defined in the enumerators' instructions. And you'll see that shortly after the 1890 census, we would open the Ellis Island Immigration Station in the New York Harbor as the main immigration center on the East Coast. We also had a separate Civil War, a schedule for the Civil War veterans and their widows. And there was a separate schedule if they were on the Union side. 1890 was also the first time the census used administrative records to collect data on indebtedness of private corporations and individuals. Unfortunately, about 95% of the 1890 schedules were destroyed in a fire. So for some reason, nobody thought it would be a bad idea to let our security guards smoke around a lot of old paper. The fire happened in the night of 1921. In the 1890 census was probably the most comprehensive schedule we ever had, and it collected a lot of data on Civil War veterans. And unfortunately, all those schedules were lost. And anyone who does genealogy and had family back then finds that 1890 would solve so many of their problems. But unfortunately, it just doesn't exist anymore. 1900 census was the first time we enumerated all American Indians on the general schedule. Hawaii, which has been annexed in 1898, was included in this census for the first time. We also started enumerating soldiers and sailors who may not be here. They were enumerated by the Department of War and the Navy. In both 1890 and 1900, we really increased our categories of what we asked. We asked about utilities, transportation, even juvenile delinquency. But we did eliminate certain racial categories. No longer did we use categories such as mulatto, quadroon, octoroon. Those only appeared for one time. We asked a lot of social statistics on chronic illnesses, home ownership, indebtedness, number of children, and if you are taking up your naturalization papers. I mean, the plethora of information they collected in 1890 and 1900 is just fascinating. And everyone who's ever looked at these schedules, they read almost like novels. In 1902, the Census Bureau established the Census Bureau. Initially, we were under the Department of Interior, and then we moved on to the Department of Labor and Commerce. And then in 1913, when the Department of Labor and Commerce split into two separate departments, we stayed with the Department of Commerce, which is where we remain today. In 1905, the economic census was separated from the decennial census. We were collecting so much information in the decennial that they decided to separate the economic census from the decennial. The economic census will be taken every 5 years in between the censuses, and that is as it remains today. In 1910, we started using the usual place of residence. Prior to 1910, you had a lot of people who would work for long periods of time away from their family, especially out west. You would have men working in logging camps, mining camps, where their families were living elsewhere. And they would be enumerated in those mining and logging camps. So, starting in 1910, they considered, where do you usually live? Even if you're away for school at work, you'll be enumerated with your family because that's where you live. 1910 was also the first time they added the racial category other, which we still use today. 1910 the census became the basis to mobilize our economy and population for World War I. The Census Bureau was able to use its compiled population and economic data to report a population of draft age men along with different states' industrial capacities. In fact, the Census Bureau conducted emergency censuses in 1917 of vital industries, including steel, wool, leather, and explosives to support the war effort. There was no apportionment after the 1920 census. In 1929, Congress passed the 1929 Reapportionment Act. This bill declared that the House of Representatives would be apportioned based on the results of the 1930 census. Between 1910 and 1920, obviously we had World War I. A lot of the countries that existed in 1910 did not exist in 1920. And countries that did not exist in 1920 or 1910 now existed in 1920. So we provided enumerators a long list of the new countries to remind them. We added new questions about naturalization and the mother's tongue. We would ask where you were born, where your mother was born, where your father was born, because one of the statistics they were interested in was they were trying to find out where the immigrants were coming from, where they were going to, how many people were native born, and have one parent who's foreign born versus native born. And also, 1920 was the first time that the majority of the U.S. population lived in urban areas. In 1930, Congress just applied the subjects to the question, not the questions. But now, since we had a permanent Census Bureau with a census director as opposed to a superintendent, that director could work directly with the Secretary of Commerce, who obviously would work with the other secretaries across all other government agencies to determine what statistical data was needed across all federal agencies. We also saw racial categories for Black, Mexican, Filipino, Hindu, and Korean added. Mexican would be a category, and then we would not see a category for Hispanics until we tested it in 1970. And then we saw it for everybody in 1980. 1930 was the beginning of the Depression, so we had two unemployment censuses in 1931 and 1937. These were of mixed use because they were self-reported. So we didn't get as strong as a statistical probability as we would like for those unemployment surveys. 1940 census introduced statistical sampling, where 5% of the population was asked an additional 16 questions. This was the start of the long form of the census. About 1 in 6 households received the long form. To gauge the effect of the Great Depression on the nation's housing stock, a census of occupied dwellings was coupled with the usual demographic questions. One of the things they wanted to know, to look at, was the need for public housing programs. In 1940, census data was used extensively in our World War II plan. We used census data to figure out, what do we have? What are our minerals like? What raw materials do we have? What manufacturing base do we have? What kind of people do we have demographically, and how many people? And they put it together, they delivered to the White House on December 10th, actually 1941. And in it, they said, we will have enough people, manpower, materials, and manufacturing to invade Europe in May or June of 1944. And of course, they were correct. 1940 census was also extensively used to help people trying to prove their citizenship as people came to work for government or enlisted in the military. You have to remember that in 1970 or 1940, not everybody had a birth certificate, so they could use their census information. In 1950, Americans abroad were enumerated. 1950 actually was the first time we saw a huge number of Americans and their families stationed abroad from the military and from the civilians. We had bases in Germany and Japan and the occupation forces. So this was the first time we had to enumerate Americans abroad. Also in 1950, we had more training specific to count transients. These were people that often fall in between the cracks because they didn't have a set address. They would set up a transit night, and there'd be one night where the enumerators would go out to all the houses, the hospitals, the hotels, and so forth, and try to count them at once. Now, naturally, you're always going to have double counts. In fact, I think it was pretty much every president in the 19th and early 20th century was double counted, both at the White House and then wherever they came from. 1950 was the first we used detailed street maps, because before then people would use whatever maps they were available. In 1951, we had UNIVAC 1. That was the first non-Department of Defense computer that came to the Census Bureau. and it was used to calculate part of the 1950 census. It was a card to tape converter which transferred data onto paper punch cards to magnetic computer tape that the UNIVAC would process and tabulate the 1950 census. The 1960 census was when we started beginning experimenting with mail out and mail back. We tried it in the urban areas. We mailed out the questionnaire and told people, fill them out, hold on to them, and we'll have our numerator come pick them up. In 1960, we developed FOSDIC, F-O-S-D-I-C. We used to have our in-house machine shop that would invent new things and easier and better ways to collect the data and to process data. And anyone who's taken a standardized test, you have to fill in those little circles and use a pencil, and it got scanned. That's thanks to the Census Bureau. FOSDIC eliminated the need to transfer data to the punch cards. On the 1970 census, we computerized the address list called address coding guides. They helped assign census geographic codes to the questionnaires. 1970 was the first time we tested separate questions on Hispanic origin. Also, for the first time, residents of urban and surrounding areas were instructed to mail their forms back to the Census Bureau, where enumerators reviewed them and used follow-up interviews to check on missing or incorrect responses. Rural householders received questionnaires in the mail, but they were asked to hold them for pickup by enumerators. In 1980, we went to mail out and mail back for everyone. And that's what many of you are familiar with today. You get the census form, you fill it out, and you mail it back. If you don't mail it back, the enumerators come into your house. 1980 was the first census in which a state, namely California, recorded a population of 20 million. And also in 1980, we started creating state data centers, the state data center programs. They would help us simplify access to data, increase our outreach to transient population, reduce undercounts, and try to get those hard to count populations. And sometimes it's just easier to do things at the state and local level rather than to set up a federal policy, because each state can be unique and provide different challenges. In 1980, we used special trained enumerators to count people staying at homeless shelters, soup kitchens, bus and rail stations, dormitories, and others. 1990 census, we created the Tiger system, which produced our maps. And that early GPS that was developed here in the Census Bureau, instead of having to hand draw these maps, which are hard to believe, but up until 1990, our geographers would literally overlay and hand draw many of these maps. So now we were able to use early GPS data and other input to produce our maps. And also in 1990, we were the first government agency to make the information available on CD-ROMs. Americans were alerted to the importance of responding to the 90 census by extensive public television, radio, print advertising, promotion activities, which included complete count committees, information kits and lesson plans for schools, which was called Census in Schools, and for churches, local government outreach, and partnership and pro bono public service announcements. In 2000, we put out an ad campaign to reach 99% of the residents, and our campaign was in 17 different languages. It was a $167 million advertising contract. In 2000 was also the first time you had multiple ways to respond. You could mail out and mail back. You could talk to your enumerator. We also had a small amount of internet available, or you could do it by telephone. The internet did become the principal dissemination medium for the 2000 census, all four of the detailed files, now called summary files, were available to be downloaded as soon as they were released. Individual tables could be viewed through the Census Bureau's online database, which was called American Fact Finder at the time. In 2005, the American Community Survey replaced the long form of the census, because what we realized is we couldn't wait 10 years to get some of this data. The ACS is a nationwide survey that collects and produces information on social, economic, housing, and demographic characteristics of our nation's population every year. The Census Bureau contacts over 3.5 million addresses a year, so that's over 290,000 a month across the country to participate in the ACS. The ACS allows communities to have ongoing information instead of having to wait 10 years. We know how fast things move. 10 years is too long. It's a completely different country, to be a completely different neighborhood. So ACS was rolled out in 2005. In 2010, census was the first time there was no long form since 1940. All households received the same 10 questions. 2010 census was the first time we counted the same-sex couples. Prior to that, you could choose roommate, boarder. 2010 was the first time we counted same-sex couples as married couples. 2010 featured a $133 million 4-month-long advertising campaign. It officially began in January of 2010. The advertising campaign debuted the night of January 17th during NBC's Golden Globe Award broadcast. In total, the 2010 advertising campaign included television, radio, print, internet advertising. It was in 28 languages. More than half of the budget advertising would target media consumed by minorities and ethnic audiences. The Census Bureau at the time anticipated that the campaign would reach the average person 42 times with messages about the importance of participating in the census. In 2020 census was unique because it was the first time we used satellite imagery to check addresses. We were able to validate 65% of the addresses in office. So then we could reduce our workforce that would have to go out and do on-the-ground canvassing. The 2020 census was also the first time everyone had the option to respond online. And we saw that 67% of the households in the United States responded online to the 2020 census. In 2020, census takers collected information on smartphones using a custom application created by the Census Bureau. And they made sure that all data were encrypted and the devices, they had a two-factor authentication to be unlocked. I'm sorry. And they also used existing government data sources to answer census questions or reduce follow-up workload. So they, instead of having to go back to the home several times and how to identify vacants, they could use administrative sources. And just a few things about data dissemination and training. You can bring our data experts to you. You can request a free data training for your organization on census.gov/academy. You can receive our data gems if you'd like. Those are short how-to videos. They're usually like 2 or 3 minutes. They show you how to use a data tool or talk about census data. You can get access to our courses. You can learn at your own pace. You can interact with our instructors via instructors via webinars. You can learn about our data releases and tools while attending these live virtual classes. And thank you. And there's my contact information in case you should need it. Does anybody have any questions?
That's a lot of information. Thank you, Tim. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I guess my first question is, this is a lot of information. What steps? So one of the things we talk about in the group quite a bit is actually, you know, the mistakes that we come across. And so I'm just wondering what, if the Census Bureau, what steps the Census Bureau takes to counter that, and maybe how that's changed over time and how you're able to deal with it.
Well, they do a lot of different things. I mean, they edit them. The editing process is a lot better. They also do, what do they call it? They do that where they do a sample of the non-response at the end. They'll try to check to see, you know, basically who responded, what the non-response rate was, or double response, different things like that. So there's a lot of more editing things done in, you know, nowadays since the early censuses. The early censuses, you know, those are harder to work with, a lot of them, because as I said, a lot of them, you know, they up until like 1840, they were just listing the head of household, and some of those earlier censuses too, they were just putting initials on the schedules. I mean, so I just say, you know, they go through a lot more editing process right at this, you know, in these more recent censuses to eliminate those mistakes. And you'll probably see, you know, they released the 40 and the 50, so you'll see the censuses getting better as we go along. Easier to find things.
Well, I personally think it's amazing that they're as accurate as they are. I mean, that's just so many people, so much information. So yeah, it's awesome.
I had a question. There's the 72-year time period before releasing the census. Was that part of the original law that Congress enacted about doing the census, or was that figured out later on?
I'm not sure exactly when that was figured out. I want to say, I'm not sure what year I could find out, or how that came about, but I know it was due to, you know, everybody probably knows it's due to the average length of age back, you know, when that law was written. But I don't know, I couldn't say exactly when that was, when it came about. I could do some checking and get back to you.
Well, and I guess if it was the average age at the time that they established that, the average age today is obviously much longer. So there are a number of people who are still alive today who were on that 1950 census, which would show where they were born, and who their parents were.
Yeah.
And could lead to identity theft issues.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and I just hear, you know, that's funny you should say that, because I hear a lot of people wanting the reverse. They want an earlier release, and they want that number, that 72 years, to be lessened. So, but I can understand for sure both. I mean, for sure, the keeping it there or even making it a little bit longer. Anything else? If you think of anything and you want to, just you can email me at timothy.a.sarko@census.gov.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Tim. Really appreciate it. I'm sure we'll talk more about this as a group, and it'd be great. Because it's recorded, we'll be sharing it with anyone else who's interested in it, and we'll go from there. So really, really do appreciate you taking the time and sharing all that information.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.